Who do I have in front of me at all?
Michael, this is Elaine FitzPatrick from Tipperary town.
And Elaine, have you lived in Tipperary all your life, Tipperary town?
I was born in Tipperary. I've lived in Cork when I was in college, and I've lived in New York for a number of years, and returned in 2001 to Tipperary. Returned to a family business. It's a printing company that my grandfather started in back in 1911. So we're printing in Tipperary for a long time.
And that particular printer was a political edge to it, was there? Or side to it?
There was actually, yeah. The newspaper that was printed there was called the Tipperary People, and my grandfather's brother, Sean FitzPatrick, went in there first, working there in 1908, and the proprietor, John McCormack, was actually very instrumental in the nationalist movement at the time, and prior to that in the New Tipperary campaign, the Planet campaign and New Tipperary. He would have, I suppose, promoted the idea of New Tipperary and that agitation that took place in Tipperary in the 1990s. So I think that was the precursor to their involvement in the revolutionary period. My grandfather's witness statement has always been there in the house for me to read, and I was lucky enough to live with him for some of my childhood, and a lot of his old comrades would come to the house and talk with him. So being one of the eldest grandchildren, didn't realise at the time what a privilege it was to be just sitting in their company and hearing little bits of information that at the time didn't make an awful lot of sense to me, but as you get older and you get I have a particular interest in history, and in that particular period in time. And again, it's the secondary teachers that I had. The history teacher was Dr. Desmond Mann, and one of the first days when he heard my name in school, he said, "Well, you know who your people are, and you know their history. You should be telling us about Irish history or the history of Tipperary." And I suppose that piqued my interest. Like, why is a teacher saying this to me and making a big fuss about my grandfather and granduncles? So I did go home and then ask that question, and some of the information was slow to come by. You only acquire it over a number of years, and you only process it as an adult, maybe more so. But they were extraordinary. They went into this printing company as apprentices. It's an interesting career. You have to, they must have been quite clever and quite educated, because they were typesetters, which means that you're actually setting type for a newspaper. It's intense work. They went in there at 13 years of age, and it was I think it's a 4 or 5 year indentured ship that they had, and in that period of time, they joined the IRB, and then they would have been at the founding of the 3rd Tipperary Brigade. They would have been some of the first members, with Sean Tracy and Dan Breen, the Barlows, Paul Merrigan, Ty Crow from Solid Beg. There were so many names that were familiar to me, because these people as old men sat in our living room and or the parlour, which was the home place that we grew up in. I suppose you just absorb it, and then you want to research more and hear more about them.
And the two men, your grandfather's name and his brother, what were their names?
My grandfather was Michael FitzPatrick, and kind of in literature he features in Ernie O'Malley's book, gosh, it's after going for me, but he would have been known as Mickey Fitz to everybody. And then Sean FitzPatrick was his older brother, and they had a younger brother then, Packy FitzPatrick, and whereas they would have been out on the run, Packy was the youngest, stayed home, and would have been part of, say, the Civil Guard during the Civil War period in Tipperary town, the Republican Guards, say.
And what was their mother and father's name, do you know?
John FitzPatrick and Elaine FitzPatrick, and they were the caretakers of the cemetery, which only opened in 1914. So the location of that is quite significant, I suppose, in that they had a good escape route when they were on the run, or there's fields at the back of it, and it was a new cemetery, so they had there was a cottage that went with that job. So when they had to escape out the back, they got out the back and back over the fields to Grenane or back over by Crogue.
So they served their trade for 5 or 6 years, you were
Yeah.
saying? In this printing, in
Yeah.
these printers.
Yeah.
And you actually have some of the documents, don't you?
I do, yeah. I've been trying to catalogue or to calendar a lot of their material, because they kind of, I suppose the one thing about them is that it never left them, the War of Independence and the Civil War. They felt a huge responsibility to all the men that would have fought with them or died with them. So they were all very involved in Uncle Sean and the National Graves Association, setting it up, which was a national organisation. And then my grandfather would have been very involved in 3rd Tipperary Brigade Old IRA Commemoration Committee. And so the first kind of thing was after the Civil War, a lot of men were unemployed and on hard times, so they would have run a lot of benefit dances, held raffles, numerous different churchgate collections for old comrades. The next stage of it was then erecting commemorative plaques or monuments around the area. Again, the 1916 50th anniversary, they'd have been very involved in working on that and putting the big monument up in Solhead Beg. And then just, so all of that documentation was there. And as I was going through all that, trying to catalogue it, I found actually their indentured papers from the Tipperary People newspaper, from Uncle Sean's from 1908 and my grandfather's from 1911. They would have been, say, very much part of the headquarters and the organisational officers in the 3rd Brigade. So a lot of their time would actually have been would have been spent, say, with Ernie O'Malley and Sean Tracy, actually typing up, creating circulars, getting dispatches ready, organising people. So they seem to have quite analytical brains, that they organised a lot of that administrative work. So if a dispatch had to be sent out, for all of his life, my grandfather always had used a carbon copy. So that's why I have this material. So he would never send a letter without making a carbon copy of it. So I suppose it was part of the trade that he also would have been able to type. So some of the material would be typed letters, or all of the military bureau statements he would have typed, not just his but other people's. And so there was quite always an archive of material. The other thing is where we live. Is when I was a child, it was over the printing works, and the attic there would have had all the old newspapers, copies of them. They're now in the National Library archives, and in the local studies department, some of them in Thurles. But I actually, as a child, could play amongst those. The attic was just a full stairs up from my room. There was no door to it. So, those kind of things make a difference. It makes it easier to kind of access information. So as I said, he always made a carbon copy or typed the material, so it was there to look back over. And the same with Uncle Sean. He wrote a book in about 1970 on the 3rd Brigade, and they would also both have been quite involved in the pension applications. Uncle Sean was a verifying officer, so they felt very strongly about trying to access pensions for their comrades, and they spent, on a voluntary basis, years of their lives on that. And again, a lot of that material is there.
And have you found documents with those carbon copies of circulars, or have you found stuff in the archives yourself?
I wouldn't have found circulars of the actual material during the War of Independence or Civil War. A lot of that material was actually destroyed during the Civil War. Clonmel was one of the publications that Uncle Sean and Nora O'Keefe produced, and again, it would have been like nowadays where you can use your phone and send out a message. This was the anti-treaty side's propaganda, or PR to circulate. So it was trying to get their point of view maybe out, which is interesting. They had an underground press, printing press, and actually meant to bring a handset of type just to show how that would have been done. It isn't an easy matter, So, but the idea of that in a hidden compartment in a shed. Somebody brought me to that shed last year, so it still exists, and it's not in bad condition. So it's amazing, and it was never found. And the same building, like a lot of notable people stayed there, like Sean, say De Valera stayed there, Countess Markovich was there, Liam Lynch. So they kind of, Ernie O'Malley would have been there with them a lot. The printing press was there, and it was quite an elaborate kind of hidden compartment within a shed.
And how detailed would the publication have been? Was it folded, stapled? Was it?
I think it was only a one-sheet piece. Yeah, that's. I think there may be one or two copies in the National Library. So, yeah.
And it's interesting. Here you are now, a printer yourself.
Still printing. Yeah, my brother was actually born in the printing works. He's the printer there, and I'm the typesetter designer. And I said he had no chance because he was born at the foot of the stairs in the building. It's interesting. The smell of most people when they come into the building, the smell of ink is what they get. We're immune to it.
Tell me this. Come back to your grandfather then. And his brother, and he was part of the Tipperary 3rd Brigade. Did you ever hear stories? I know you can probably access them through the witness statements, but did you ever hear first-hand stories from him?
Yeah, I suppose one of the people that would have come to the house quite regularly was Ty Crow, and Ty Crow would have been involved in Solhead Beg, and they would have discussed that quite a lot. Just different aspects of it. A certain amount. There was a certain reluctance. When they're talking about it, there's a certain amount of guilt, I feel, or it was never. I'm trying to find the right words. It was never like they were proud of it. It was more that there was sorrow about the people that got killed. Regret. The only crossword I ever heard, my granduncle, he would have been alive till I was 16, was his only bitterness I felt was being excommunicated from the church during the Civil War. That was a very hard thing for them to take. They felt that very badly, and it weighed on them a lot. But my grandfather had a very interesting story about the ambush in Thomastown, and he was shot in that. It would have been with Dilly Lacey. It was one of the first of engagements of the flying columns in October 1920, and in it he actually got shot. He got a slight graze to his forehead, but he got at least one shot in his thigh, And I suppose it's to a child hearing it, it was the I found it fascinating, but I'm sure he wasn't finding it fascinating, like that he was quite injured and had to actually be taken over the shore to escape and was brought to Limerick. And I think it took a couple of days to get to a hospital. And when I was asking my father about it, he said to him, his father was always an old man and walked with a walking stick. So this injury was always with him. But part of the funny bit about it to us, but he genuinely believed that it was a miracle that he was saved. First of all, when he was in hospital, he had to be hidden from British forces that were coming searching, and I believe a nun, I don't know, did she cover him in bandages, or she hid him in some way that they didn't discover him. And the other thing is that because it had been so long before the wound was treated, that at one point they thought that he was going to lose his leg, but I think some priest came in and blessed him, and he felt it was a miracle that, you know, that he didn't lose his leg. So, but again, it was just the whole escapade, you know, of them getting him, you know, over the river, getting him into a car, which was unusual. You weren't meant to. You had permission to be in a car, but I think they had a sympathetic. I think it was a sympathetic British Englishman that drove the car. So when he was stopped, they were left pass by. So it was an interesting story. I suppose their witness statements, Grandad's in particular, was really interesting because it gave a great background to his family, and he went into a lot of detail about where they came from, that his great-grandfather came in from Hollyford, would have had a Fenian tradition, would have served time during the Ballyhurst uprising, and then that, you know, he was a gardener, and that they went into the printing profession. And I suppose, you know, him joining the IRB, and you know, just the various engagements that he was involved in. When I actually accessed his pension application, only became available recently. So in looking at that, after the Thomastown incident and getting injured, he actually went to Mallow and was with a Cork battalion that was involved in the ambush of or the attack on Mallow barracks. But the funny thing about it was, in his pension application, he was actually docked money for while he was out injured, and that was a big sore point with him. And there's letters back and forth where he argued that, you know, that he was still on active duty, but the way that they actually assessed you and paid your pension, he was actually docked 6 months while he was injured. So that was an interesting one, and it was something that I hadn't been aware of before. And like that, he actually worked in Mallow Printing Works while he was there in Mallow for that few months also.
What drove him to join the IRB?
I think the two influences like that, that the fact that his grandfather would have been involved. Ballyhurst is just outside the town, and for where they live in Crogue, it's literally wouldn't be a kilometre away. I suppose the other thing was the whole New Tipperary, that I think all of the young people in Tipperary saw that you could have an impact. Like literally, New Tipperary, for people that don't know about it, it was where the people that owned or rented their premises on the main street and other streets in Tipperary, in solidarity with tenants of the Smith Barry estate in Cork and Photo Island. They refused to pay their rent and instead went to a fresh area of ground in the town and built a new town there. Unfortunately, it didn't succeed. But the amazing thing was that it actually hurt them a lot more than other places, because they actually had built these buildings themselves. It was only ground rent they were paying. I think what it shows is there was an enormous conviction in Tipperary to whatever cause they got involved in. They also, I suppose, he attended the national school, the monastery school, and he started attending Irish classes, Gaelic League. So that whole, revival, Irish, that revival movement seemed to strike with him strongly, and like that he could speak Irish, and across the street from the printing works was the Gaelic League. Say the head of that he was living there, Paddy Kelly. So they're the kind of things that I suppose influenced him the most. Didn't ever hear too much about his mother, but they seem to have been a very close family. His sister Daisy and his sister Sissy, both of them, although they weren't in Common Mon, would have played quite a big role in just supplementary helping them during the time when they were on the run. Like, they started out in Tipperary, and from there, because they would have been involved in the organisation of the entire brigade, and they would have been, with Mrs. Tobin in Cahir, Tincurry, and then they moved from there to Rose Green, would have been the headquarters. They like that, they would have done all the usual things of drilling, carrying out different ambushes, and but I do think a lot of their time was taken up in administrative duties and correspondence, whereas other more prominent people would have moved around maybe more. They would have been quite, in the one base, from Tipperary to Rose Green. It doesn't seem of a huge distance, but when you look at how they travelled, which would have been cross country, or through the Galties, Shievenamon area, it would have always been through the countryside as opposed to through the main roads.
Was the house ever raided at all in your family home?
Yeah, their family home was raided a number of times, and they would be searched for. My Uncle Sean was, he was ordered out of Tipperary after Salahead Beg in 1919, and he would have served time in Cork prison. Again, Grandad would have been working there at the same time, so I'm not sure at what point he also went on the run. But they kind of were known to the RIC. The RIC barracks is actually only a stone's throw. It's at the top of the street from the printing works. So it's a Tipperary town. It's a compact town. It's a very long main street, but it's the main route from Waterford to Limerick. And the railway line runs that way also. So again,
how old were they when this was going on?
They would have been only, I'd say, at the start of this, only 18 or 19, 20 at the most. Like the other kind of interesting one, like we all know Dan Breen's name, and we hear of Salahead Beg. But the other kind of interesting event that they were at was that they were one of the main guests at Dan Breen's wedding in back in 1920. So so they're there in the photos, in the official photos. So that's an interesting one, and that they were camping out the night before Dan Breen's wedding, and my Uncle Sean's words were that as single men they were giving him plenty of advice. It kind of, that one is kind of one that always kind of interested me. The fact that you had this wedding and you've one of the most wanted men, and here they are all having a wedding out in the open. But it was well guarded at the time, the area. And there was a reenactment, or a kind of we tried to reenact the wedding last year. So a number of the relatives came to the same spot, and it was actually eerie to look out over it, because you can actually see quite a distance, if anybody was approaching. So it was very interesting to be there 100 years later, where your relatives. But I kind of say that, and then I'm there in the same building that they were working in every day of my life. So,
and come the War of Independence, signing of the treaty, they took the anti-treaty side.
Yeah. I suppose the Third Brigade would have been one of the most active during the War of Independence, and one of the groups that would have had the most resolve, but also that had one of the highest casualty rates, and a lot of engagements. So I suppose they just felt that it wasn't what they had fought for, or it wasn't what their relatives and friends had died for. Again, a lot of them, it wasn't an easy decision for them, but they felt betrayed, I suppose, in some ways. That seems to be the overriding thing that I can read from it or decipher from it. And I don't believe they wanted to fight. I think things just escalated after you had a period of inaction. I think when the truce was called, the Third Brigade in particular continued training and had training camps that they believed the war was going to restart. So I don't know, part of it is who was there with them. Was Ernie O'Malley was their main commanding officer. So once you have a strong personality like that, Seamus Robinson was the next in command. The battalions and the brigades had all been reassigned, and just before the treaty, there was a First Southern Brigade which had amalgamated Limerick, parts of Kilkenny and Tipperary. And I just think Tipperary is different to Dublin. There was a couple of instances during the truce time. There was a couple of interactions with Michael Collins that maybe influenced their decision. They were called for a few. Some of the main, I suppose, infractions of the treaty occurred in Tipperary and would have been with the Third Brigade. Uncle Sean was the liaison officer during that period of time, and he ended up resigning his position because of those, because of those infractions. One of them being the acquisition of arms and guns from and I think an armoured car from and other vehicles from Clonmel barracks. So and also the Hutmans in Tipperary Down. So I think those things influenced their decision. They would have been signatories. All of the Third Brigade would have been signatories to an alternative declaration denouncing the treaty and putting forth their ideals or their ideas on it. I think after the bombing of the Four Courts, the shelling of the Four Courts, the fact that a column was going up from Tipperary, you just had there was a period of inaction, and and reluctance to actually engage in fighting. I think it took the column 2 weeks to get to Dublin from Tipperary in an armoured car or in a truck. I think it was a reluctance to really engage. They didn't really want to. And then unfortunately, after Michael Collins was killed, things tit for tat, executions, and I think they kind of were the death blow to Republicans, that once the executions started taking place, there was a kind of retribution mindset. And I do think people have to understand that a lot of the Republican soldiers had been fighting since 1918 or even 1916. So they were hardened to war. They had suffered deprivations. They had probably had jail time. And that kind of set them, that even though they know maybe even at some point in 1923 they probably realised that it was that they weren't going to win, they kept fighting, and I think that's the saddest part for them, that it's kind of hard to say anything more about it. Even after the Civil War, when they were arrested and put into camps in the Curragh, they went on hunger strike. My grandfather and granduncle would have been on hunger strike for over 34 days. I think anybody that has even tried to fast for 24 hours can see that you have a lot of resolve if you can go that long. That would have been the second time I think they would have been on hunger strike. So you have to admire their convictions,
And when they got out of the Curragh or wherever they were, they came back down to Tipperary town, did they?
Yeah, actually, yeah. The minute they came back, they set up FitzPatrick printers. They immediately started fundraising for their comrades that were in hard times. Like I have the notebooks of the pennies that were collected for that they'd hold a Republican dance, or they'd raffle a greyhound. Just extraordinary kind of things that they got involved in because they felt such a responsibility to these people. They didn't walk away and say, "Well, that's over now." And Tipperary town in particular, there was an actual battle for Tipperary town. There was hand-to-hand combat during the Civil War, and there was a lot of destruction caused by the Republicans on their retreat from the town into the Galtee Mountains. And I do feel that a certain amount of the town suffered. I mean, Tipperary probably hasn't recovered 100 years later, Tiptown, because of that. And policies are made on a national level based on, those decisions. So.
What do you mean? Were there businesses burnt down, or is there?
There were, yeah. I mean, the actual barracks, which was a huge barracks that was built the 1850s, 60s. That had held up to 10,000 British soldiers during the First World War. That was one of them. The waterworks, bridges out of the town, the creamery, which was a big employer in the town. Cleves they would have been basically destroyed, but the town had suffered a lot during the War of Independence as well. So, the actual structure of the town, a huge number of the businesses during that period also would have been destroyed by the Black and Tans, either burnt out. So I suppose nobody likes that, and at different times I'm told your lot burnt the barracks and what we'd have in the town if the barracks was still there. But on the site of it, I think there's something that everybody in Tip should be very proud of. Every Saturday, Sunday morning, and most days during the week, there's Irish dancing in the hall there. There's about 500 children playing Gaelic sport, football and hurling. Every evening they're training there. Older people use the hall to play cards. It's a central point for the community, and it's named after Sean Tracy. So I think it couldn't have any better purpose. Sorry, that's my take on that. There's a lot of other buildings, big buildings sitting abandoned in Tipperary. There was a huge workhouse just across from the barracks that's sitting desolate. Nobody wants to do anything with that. The railway station is the exact same one that was there. That building is now a small enterprise centre. We can all choose what use something might have had, but I think to see a match there any day of the week for my kids, it's fantastic.
And you were saying that one of the things that hurt them in was the Catholic Church disowned them, was it?
During the Civil War, the Catholic bishops came out and basically said that, and any of the Republican soldiers, I don't have the exact wording, but they basically were excommunicated. They weren't also allowed to be brought to church when they died. And that in our own family, my granduncle was killed during the Civil War, Jerry Kiley, and he wasn't allowed into the church. And that created a lot of sadness and hurt. I think that's the thing. I think the Civil War was an awful thing to be brought on the country, and nobody wanted it. Certainly not my family. I don't believe they wanted it. But the repercussions for my great grandfather was born just after the famine, and he had one son, and there's a monument up near where he was killed in the Glen of Arlo, and it's just very poignant that it was erected by his father. It just shows that sorrow, that the hurt that he felt, that his name had died out with his son. And that's the thing, all life is precious, and I do feel that when that kind of been excommunicated from the church, when that was put on the Republican soldiers when they were going out to fight, was a huge burden on them that people may not have realised. And equally, you would have had newspapers showing priests blessing the Free State soldiers before they went out to fight and absolving them of any crimes. So they found that very difficult. Jerry Kiley was my grandmother's only brother. As I said, he was killed during the Civil War. He was Dan Breen's aide-de-camp, which was his bodyguard. They were together in McDonough's house in Lisburnan. Paddy McDonough had been killed with Dinny Lacey a couple of weeks previously. They were in the house with his parents, and the Free State soldiers surrounded the house. My granduncle had been with Dan Breen in America during the truce, and when they heard of the fighting in the forecourts, they came back to Ireland, to Tipperary, and had taken the anti-treaty side. And unfortunately, a Free State soldier was killed in that instant, and within a minute, I presume my granduncle had shot him, and he then was killed. The Thompson machine gun that he had jammed and trying to get out the front door, he was killed instantly. And I suppose the trauma for the family was felt for a long, long time. As I said, he was the only son. the fact that when he was brought to his family home, that during the week that the Free State soldiers raided the house, that the church wouldn't allow him into the church, and that his father had to bring him on a cart to be buried, caused a lot of trauma in the family. And we still get emotional actually about it. So, yeah.
You can understand why.
Yeah. Yeah. For us, he's the Galtee Mountain Boy. And that song is one that, when my father was being buried, we played, because to them, that's who he was. He was romanticised by his two sisters who survived to their children. They actually all lived together in the one household that I grew up in. And I suppose the trauma for them was ongoing, that their house was raided by the Black and Tans. His niece was knocked into the fire by them and badly burnt. She died later. They didn't seem to get over the trauma for, I suppose, most of their lives. My Auntie May lived with us, and she probably was affected by it. The pension application for Jerry Kiley and by my great-grandfather, was sealed up until recently, because just, I suppose, some of the trauma that they endured was in it. And when I read it, I was broken down in tears. And I suppose until my grandfather married Josie Kiley, they were almost, they were penniless, and they were almost destitute. So I do feel that that was part of the reason my grandfather married her, that he felt that responsibility.
There was a huge price paid, and even simple things that, like, people trying to get pensions, people didn't have money.
Yeah, like it went on for years. The first set of pensions, the participants in the Civil War and on the Republican side, I don't think were allowed apply. So it wasn't until the 1930s. And the problem was that there were specific dates that were very important. So somebody had to be, what was your position? How many men did you command at a particular date? The two dates being important. The date the truce was called in 1921, and then say at the end of the Civil War. So there was huge work in, actually, a lot of this material wouldn't have been written down, so you had to go through the 3rd Brigade. Uncle Sean had estimated had about 3,000 members, soldiers, during that period, and you had to then break it down into the different battalions and different areas. So you to try and contact the different officers and where they were. And because it would have been mostly in Tipperary, not everybody, but mostly an anti-treaty side, a lot of them actually were very disillusioned afterwards and went to America or emigrated to England. So even to track down these people. So again, some of the things that I have are ledgers from Grandad, and it would have the name of the person and their circumstance at that in the 20s and 30s, and the state of their health. And it might be just one or a two-liner, but all of a sudden, some of these names are still, they're families that are still living in Tipperary, and it's amazing to identify with them, and to just see the names. So he would have put down where they were now, what their circumstance was, and then after that they would have had to go to the various officers of particular battalions, get them to write down everything that the battalion had done, or the column had done, and then get somebody to verify that. And that had to happen for every pension application. You had to put down every detail of what engagements you were involved in, where you were at certain times. So there is a wealth of information, and that is even accessible to people now online. First of all, you have the witness statements, which they were also very involved in getting people to put forward their witness statements from Tipperary. But the pension applications was the huge project, and also living and being local, it was a huge task on them to be fair to people, like how do you tell somebody who's in really bad circumstance that the pension application, the way that it's conceived, and because you only had 10 people under you, you're only going to get a minimal pension. From my great grandfather, for the death of his son, after years of campaigning, was €100. There was a price paid, but there was also a price put on death and suffering. And again, I don't believe the Free State soldiers that died, I think they had an awfully difficult time also accessing pensions, their relatives afterwards. People who were also injured and had lifelong injuries, those things didn't really, there was a small pittance, I would call it, paid for, an injury that you might have sustained. But, and then, you have an unfairness that, and we could see it within our own family, that Uncle Sean got the highest pension achievable because he would have been active from 1916 up to 1923 and would have been commanding the mid brigade in, which give you a better, a better pension and more status, and you had the two different extremes. And my grandfather, some of the letters were pleading to politicians. Then you'd have letters in support back from various politicians that would have been involved.
When did the two men die?
Michael FitzPatrick died in the late 70s, and Sean FitzPatrick died in the late 80s. So, like that, as a child, and a teenager, I suppose I was studying history in secondary school. So for Uncle Sean, and he was very lucid. He lived into his late 90s. So he would have spent summers with us. He would have lived in Dublin, after, I suppose sometime in the maybe 30s, he left Tipperary, and when Fianna Fáil probably came into power, he ended up being head of the Irish Tourist Board, and that then is now Irish Tourist Board. So he went a different he was involved in the National Graves Association, in the restoration of Kilmainham, in bigger, more national causes, or trying to for commemorations, things like that. Whereas Grandad, it would have been the local commemorations committees, putting up monuments to different volunteers in the area. And
here you are keeping it going still yourself.
I am, because I feel it's important. I think I would like my own children to realise that the luxury and freedoms that they have were hard won. They didn't come easy. That people do have to stand up for their beliefs, and they have to stand up for the underdog. That things aren't handed to everybody. That there are other places in the world. That there are still injustices. And I do feel if you don't know your own history, it's very hard to even empathise with other people. I think it's sad that history is no longer going to be an obligatory subject in secondary school. I think it's a choice between geography or history, which is sad. So you might know where somewhere is in the world, but you know nothing about it. I think it's one of the things that actually Irish people have a great understanding of world history, not just Irish history. But yeah, I have 4 sons, and I often imagine if they were in those circumstances, how they would react or how they would have endured. And I think one of the best traits that anybody can have is resilience and empathy. You know, they'll keep you going.
We'll end on that good note, right?
Yes, thank you.
Da